In the heart of the misty Oregon wilderness, a frightened bobcat kitten, its fur soaked and trembling, cried out for the mother it would never see again. But fate has a strange way of filling voids with unexpected love. A woman who had every reason to turn away heard that cry, and chose to follow it. What happened next defied nature, logic, and even the deepest fears. This isn't just a story of survival, this is a story of healing, of motherhood, and the invisible threads that bind two broken souls across species. Stay with us. You'll never forget what happens next. Whispers in the wilderness. Sometimes, the smallest cries echo the loudest through the forest, and into a heart that's ready to listen. The fog hung thick over the canopy of the Willamette National Forest like a breath held too long. It was early April, when spring nudges winter out of the shadows, but the chill still lingers in the bones of the trees. The branches creaked gently under the weight of dew, and the forest floor, rich with fallen needles and damp moss, exhaled a scent of earth and memory. Somewhere beneath that curtain of mist, a tiny creature shivered alone. No more than 6 weeks old, the bobcat kitten stumbled through the underbrush, her paws too small for the world she had just been forced to face alone. Her fur was a sandy cream color, speckled faintly with darker spots along her back. The black tufts at the tips of her ears trembled with every sound, and her wide, slate-blue eyes scanned every shadow for a figure that would never return. She had lost her mother, how, we don't know. Perhaps a predator had come in the night. Perhaps a snare, a flood, or something worse. But what mattered now was that she was alone. And the forest, once a cradle, now loomed like a stranger. A hawk screeched above the canopy, and the kitten flinched. She let out a high, broken mewl, soft, pitiful, nearly swallowed by the wind. Then another. And another. The cry of something not meant to be alone. Not meant to survive this place by itself. And yet, across a bend in the trail, someone heard it. About a quarter-mile west, nestled between the trees, sat a small cedarwood cabin with smoke curling from its stone chimney. The woman inside, Grace Whitmore, paused mid-step as the sound brushed the edge of her consciousness. She was in the middle of collecting mugwort near the stream, her gloved hands steady, but her mind far away. Then she heard it again. A sound too soft to be wind, too sharp to be nothing. A cry. Not human. Not fox. Not owl. Something else. Something, small. Grace's breath caught in her throat. It had been months since she had reacted to anything in the world this way. Months since she had felt anything move in the hollow space she carried around with her like a second skin. Without quite realizing it, she took a slow step toward the sound. Then another. The forest didn't answer, but it didn't object either. And somewhere, hidden under the moss and mist, the kitten cried again, waiting for something she didn't understand. Waiting for someone. Waiting for her. Grace in the silence. Some people retreat into the woods to escape the noise, Grace went there to silence the pain. Grace Whitmore didn't look like someone who belonged to the wild. At first glance, you'd mistake her for a teacher on sabbatical or maybe a tired librarian who'd once dreamed of becoming something else. But the truth was far heavier than appearances ever dared to show. At 39, Grace had the weathered beauty of someone who had been softened by sorrow but not broken by it. Her auburn hair, often tied into a careless braid, fell like a rope of forgotten fire down her back. Her hazel eyes, flecked with green, carried a distance that had nothing to do with how far she lived from town. She had moved into the cedarwood cabin 6 months ago, not for the view, not for the quiet, but because she could no longer sleep in a house filled with echoes. Portland had become unbearable. The hospital rooms, the empty nursery, the polite sympathy of friends who didn't know what to say anymore. After the miscarriage, after the divorce that followed like an aftershock. Grace had simply stopped. Stopped returning calls. Stopped making tea. Stopped pretending she wanted to be around anyone, including herself. The cabin in the Willamette National Forest was supposed to be temporary. Just a pause. A breath between the chapters of her life. But the forest, in its indifferent stillness, held her longer than she expected. It didn't ask questions. It didn't tell her to move on. It simply existed. Like she did. Grace spent her days collecting herbs, sketching wildflowers in her notebook, and volunteering remotely with a wildlife rehab center. She had always loved animals, not in a soft, pet the kitten kind of way, but in the deeper, aching recognition that they, too, often carried scars. Scars they couldn't speak about. Just like her. Her cabin was modest, a one-room living space with shelves lined in jars, a stove that groaned when lit, and a single bed pushed against the window. On the wall hung an old photo, her and her ex-husband smiling, her hand resting gently on a pregnant belly. She hadn't taken it down. Not because she couldn't. But because she wanted to remember that she had once believed. Grace wasn't trying to heal out here. She wasn't trying at all. Until the cry came. That soft, raw sound in the mist that didn't belong to any bird she knew. It caught her mid-step, and something inside her stirred. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to make her look toward the trees. And wonder, who was crying? And why did it sound so much like her? Eyes in the underbrush. The wild doesn't call gently, it whispers, then waits to see if you'll answer. The cry led her. Not like a trail. Not like a clear path. But more like a tug, quiet, urgent, instinctual. Grace stepped carefully through the forest, her boots crunching lightly over pine needles and soggy leaves, every breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. The fog curled around the trees like a ghost with no home, and for a moment, she wondered if she was imagining the sound. Then it came again. Sharper this time. Fragile. The cry of something alive, and utterly alone. She pushed past a low branch, ducked under a moss-draped limb, and paused near a cluster of rhododendron bushes. There, beneath the tangled roots of a fallen log, she saw it. A kitten, but not the kind you find curled on porches or hiding in barns. Its legs were too long, its body lean, its ears pointed and tufted like tiny antennae. A bobcat. The markings confirmed it, light fur with faint rosettes along its flank, a short tail with a black tip, and those unmistakable ear tufts standing like little flags of fear. It crouched low, its body pressed against the dirt, tiny ribs rising and falling in quick, jerky movements. Grace froze. The kitten hissed, a pitiful attempt, more a whisper than a threat. But it was still alert, still wild. Still willing to defend itself, even if the fight was already lost. Her first instinct was to back away. Wild animals didn't belong in homes. They weren't meant to be touched by human hands. Every rule of wildlife rescue screamed in her mind, never interfere unless trained, unless licensed, unless you absolutely have to. But then the kitten tried to stand. Its front right paw gave out beneath it, and it collapsed with a tiny whimper. That sound. It wasn't just pain. It was longing. Fear. Desperation. And it hit Grace like a memory, sharp and sudden, the sound she had made once, alone in a sterile hospital room when she realized the tiny heartbeat on the monitor was gone. She crouched down slowly, staying several feet away. "Hey," she whispered, voice barely above breath. "I see you." The kitten's eyes met hers, wide, round, and glassy. Not quite trusting. But not entirely afraid anymore either. She slipped off her flannel jacket and slowly laid it on the ground. The kitten didn't move. Didn't run. Didn't hiss again. Instead, it watched her, like it was trying to decide something far older than instinct. "Okay," Grace murmured. "Let's not make promises. Just, let me help." She slid the jacket forward inch by inch. The kitten trembled. Then, after what felt like an hour suspended in a heartbeat, it lowered its head. Surrender. Or maybe just exhaustion. With the utmost care, Grace wrapped the jacket around the tiny body. It was lighter than she expected. Frail. Fractured. But burning with the unmistakable heat of life. She pressed it gently to her chest and stood. The mist thickened around them. The forest stayed silent. And Grace, with the kitten in her arms, took her first real breath in months. A place not meant for wild things. Sometimes we don't choose to save something, we do it because we recognize the part of ourselves still worth saving. The cabin creaked under the wind as Grace stepped inside, the bundle in her arms motionless beneath the flannel jacket. She kicked the door shut with her boot, careful not to jostle the fragile weight against her chest. The room was dim, lit only by the smoldering glow of embers in the wood stove. She walked straight to the couch and knelt, laying the bundle down on a folded wool blanket she kept for rainy mornings and cold tea. With careful fingers, she pulled the flannel aside. The kitten stirred, but barely. Its tiny chest rose and fell rapidly, as if its breath couldn't catch up to its body. The injury to its paw was more visible now, swollen, a shallow cut along the side. Nothing broken, from what Grace could see, but enough to cripple a creature this small and vulnerable. She moved instinctively. The kettle went on. A heating pad slid beneath the blanket. She reached for a rubber-tipped feeding dropper from her wildlife first aid kit, the one she hadn't touched in over a year. Leftover broth, low-sodium chicken, went into a saucepan. She didn't think. Didn't plan. She just acted. Her hands moved with the kind of certainty grief had long since stolen from her. She was moving for someone else again. That mattered. It took 3 tries before the kitten would open its mouth for the dropper. Tiny licks at first. A wince at the warmth. Then more. Small gulps like it couldn't believe something so gentle still existed. Grace exhaled deeply for the first time all day. She watched as it nestled against the heat pad, finally letting sleep take over, its breathing slowing to a whisper. She sat back on the floor, back against the couch, and let her eyes roam the cabin. This place had once felt like a hiding spot, walls she'd chosen to build far away from everything and everyone. Now, for the first time, it didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a shelter. The kind someone else needed. That night, she didn't sleep in her bed. She stayed on the couch, the kitten nestled in its makeshift nest on the floor, her hand draped over the edge just inches away. Every few hours, it stirred. She'd stroke behind its ears gently, whispering soft encouragements she didn't realize she still knew how to say. By morning, it was still there. Still breathing. Still fighting. She called the Oregon Wildlife Rehabilitation Network first thing. The line rang and rang. Voicemail. Of course. It was Sunday. She left a message, giving her name, location, a brief description of the situation. She didn't mention the way the kitten had looked at her. Didn't mention how it hadn't hissed once since entering the cabin. Didn't mention that she was scared to let it go, even though she knew, eventually, she'd have to. As the hours passed, she cleaned a small dog crate from her storage shed and lined it with towels. Set it near the window where the sun fell in long amber stripes. She placed the kitten gently inside and sat nearby with a notebook, scribbling notes about its behavior. Eats slow but steady. Seems alert. Possibly dehydrated. Doesn't vocalize unless frightened. She paused. Then added, follows movement with eyes. Calm. Too calm. And just below that, almost as an afterthought, name, Ash. She wasn't sure why she wrote it. But the name fit. Ash, for the soft color of its fur, for the way it had emerged from the forest like a breath from something burned but still warm. Still alive. Ash didn't explore much that first day. He stayed curled tight, one paw tucked under his chest, eyes half-lidded but watching her. Grace placed his crate beside her desk as she worked, and every few minutes, their eyes would meet. Not in fear. Not quite in trust. But in something in between. By evening, Ash had eaten 2 full ounces of broth and taken a few unsteady steps within the crate. Grace watched him with an unfamiliar tightness in her throat. It was fragile. Too fragile. But it was something. And something was more than she had had in a long, long time. That night, she whispered before she turned off the lamp. "You're not mine. But I'll be yours, until you're ready." The language of small things. Trust doesn't arrive like a storm, it grows, slow and quiet, like the first leaf after winter. The days that followed unfolded like shy chapters in a forgotten book, each one quiet, tentative, and somehow sacred. Ash was still weak, but he no longer trembled. The swelling in his paw had eased with warm compresses, and though he limped, he no longer collapsed after a few steps. Grace noticed the change one morning as she refilled his bowl with warm broth. When she turned around to place the pot on the counter, she heard a soft rustle behind her. She glanced down and froze. Ash had padded out of the crate on his own. He stood, wobbly but upright, his wide eyes scanning the room like a sailor seeing land for the first time. "Hey, little man," she whispered, slowly crouching. Ash didn't run. He didn't hiss. He didn't do anything wild animals were supposed to do. Instead, he walked toward her. 2 steps. Then 3. And then he sat, right in front of her knees, looking up like he had decided something she wasn't yet privy to. She reached out slowly, brushing the fur beneath his chin. For the first time, Ash leaned in. That was the beginning. After that moment, it was as if he began testing the boundaries between their worlds. When she cooked, he sat nearby, ears twitching with every clang of metal. When she read on the porch, he curled beneath her chair, nestled into a bundle of towels she kept just for him. He started to explore the corners of the cabin, his movements still cautious, but no longer scared. Each day, Grace kept notes in her journal. Day 4, ate full chicken mash. Licked my fingers after feeding. No signs of infection in paw. Day 5, watched squirrel at window for 10 minutes. No panic response. Day 6, climbed onto the edge of the couch when I pretended not to look. Settled next to my hip. She never let herself forget, Ash was a wild animal. A predator. Not a pet. Not a project. But she couldn't ignore what was happening. They were coexisting, but it was more than that. They were healing, together. Grace found herself speaking to him out loud without thinking. Not baby talk, not nonsense, just thoughts. Today would have been her due date, she said once, eyes on the fire, voice low and steady. Ash, curled beside the hearth, lifted his head. He didn't move toward her, didn't offer any comforting sound. But he watched. Listened. And somehow, that was enough. On the 7th night, a storm rolled in. Oregon storms weren't like city rain, they were symphonies of wind and thunder, the kind that rattled windows and made the trees groan like they were mourning something. Grace lit candles and settled into bed with her book, expecting to ride out the night alone. But minutes after the thunder cracked overhead, she felt a weight at the foot of the bed. She looked down. Ash. His ears flattened slightly, not in fear, but in uncertainty. She didn't move. Didn't speak. Instead, she gently pulled back the quilt. An invitation. Ash crawled forward, slow and deliberate, and curled beside her knees. The firelight flickered across the walls. The storm outside growled like something wounded. Inside, the cabin held its breath. Grace closed her eyes. She hadn't shared her bed with anything, not a person, not a pet, since the miscarriage. The grief had taken up that space like a shadow with its own heartbeat. But now there was warmth. A pulse. A presence. And when she woke in the middle of the night, drenched in the kind of half-dream panic she thought she'd buried, Ash was still there. Eyes watching. Calm. Unmoving. Real. By morning, the storm had passed. Ash jumped from the bed before the sun finished rising and began pawing at the windowsill, watching birds flit between branches like they owned the world. Grace brewed coffee and stood beside him. He didn't flinch when she came close. Instead, he looked up at her, briefly, and then back at the trees. Trust. Not the loud kind. Not the instant kind. But the kind that grows between broken things when they choose not to run anymore. The wild always comes calling. Love, when true, knows when to hold on, and when to let go. The snow had melted. The ground, once frozen and silent, had begun to breathe again, softened by spring rains and warmed by sunlight that lingered just a little longer each day. Ash was growing fast. Too fast. Grace watched him from the porch as he leapt onto a log by the tree-line, his muscles sharper now, movements no longer clumsy but fluid, predatory. There was still something kitten-like in his curiosity, in the way he pawed at dry leaves or chased shadows on the dirt. But he wasn't a baby anymore. Not by a long shot. His coat had darkened into a beautiful mottled bronze, the rosettes on his sides now bold and distinct. His ears, once too big for his head, stood tall with confidence. And his eyes, those once glassy pools of fear, were clear, intelligent, alert. He was wild. Meant for something bigger than this small cabin and the woman who'd kept him alive. And Grace knew it. The first step was building the enclosure. Not a cage, never that, but a transitional space. A pen with logs, branches, cover, and height. A place where he could begin to remember who he was. She built it herself, with aching shoulders and splinters in her palms, every nail driven in with a strange mixture of grief and pride. It took her a week. When she placed Ash inside, he didn't protest. He explored. Tested. Climbed. Watched her from the highest branch, as if to say, I know. She began limiting his time indoors. The crate by the window remained empty now. At night, he curled beneath the trees. Sometimes she'd catch his silhouette in the moonlight, still close, but choosing distance. It was working. It was breaking her. Grace contacted the Medford Wildlife Sanctuary, a large facility 3 hours south, nestled near the foothills. They were better equipped. More land. More structure. More wild. She explained everything, his injury, his progress, his temperament. He trusts you, the woman on the other end asked. Grace hesitated. He chooses me. For now. They agreed to evaluate him in person. A final transitional step, they said. Not release, not yet, but a monitored wilderness zone with minimal human contact. Grace hung up the phone and stared at the receiver. Ash, from the yard, watched her too. She could feel his eyes on her, like he understood. He probably did. Because wild things aren't dumb. They just wait until you're ready. And Grace? She was almost ready. Almost. Into the teeth of the trees. The wild doesn't take its children back gently, it tests them, tears them, then teaches them how to survive. It happened on the third night after the call. Grace had just finished checking the latches on the outdoor enclosure when the wind picked up, fast and sharp, bending the pine trees with a sudden force. Storms weren't uncommon in April, but this one had come without warning. Thunder growled low in the distance, and clouds swallowed the stars whole. She stepped back onto the porch, casting one last glance toward Ash's enclosure. He was pacing the far corner, restless. She had seen it in him all day, that twitch beneath his skin, the growing need to move, to run. She couldn't blame him. Even she had once felt the itch to escape a life too small for her grief. But she still wasn't ready for what would come next. The crash came just after midnight. A deafening snap of wood. Grace bolted upright, heart pounding, the sound still ringing in her ears. She grabbed a flashlight and threw on her coat, running barefoot onto the porch. The enclosure was half gone. A massive branch, torn from the tree above, had smashed through one corner of the fencing like it was made of paper. The gate hung open. The ground was empty. "Ash," she called, breath fogging in the cold air. Nothing. She ran to the tree line, light cutting through the brush. Ash's tracks were clear, muddy impressions leading into the woods. No blood. No struggle. Just, gone. The storm howled overhead as she followed the path, calling his name again and again, but the forest only answered with wind and silence. Then she saw them. Not his prints, others. Larger. Whiter. Wolves. Her stomach twisted. She knelt, fingers brushing the edge of a fresh paw print near a patch of broken twigs. Ash's trail veered sharply to the east, away from the larger prints. Smart. But not smart enough to survive alone if they crossed paths. Grace kept walking, deeper into the woods than she'd gone in months. Her flashlight flickered. A branch snagged her coat. A thorn tore her hand. Still, she pressed forward. She had brought him this far. She couldn't lose him now. After 2 hours, she found a small clearing. Broken leaves. Tufts of fur. A few drops of blood. Her heart cracked. But there was no body. No drag marks. No sign of a kill. Just absence. An unfinished story. Grace stood there in the dark, frozen not by cold but by uncertainty. She didn't know what hurt worse, thinking he was gone, or not knowing if he was alive. With a trembling breath, she turned back toward the cabin. There was nothing more she could do. Not tonight. The forest had taken him. And she would have to trust, just as he once had, that maybe, just maybe, he'd find his way back. When the forest gives something back. Sometimes, those who leave don't knock when they return, they simply remind you they were never really gone. 2 days passed. 2 days of silence so thick it felt like a second skin. Grace kept herself busy. She swept the porch 3 times a day. Chopped firewood she didn't need. Cleaned the same mug until the paint wore from the rim. But nothing filled the space Ash had left behind. Every time a twig snapped outside, her heart leapt. Every time it wasn't him, it fell harder. The forest felt emptier now, not because he was gone, but because it had taken something she loved and said nothing in return. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. She stopped going to the enclosure entirely. Then, on the morning of the 3rd day, she opened the door and froze. There, on the porch, laid a rabbit. Whole. Unmarked. Not mauled. Just, placed. Like a gift. A gesture. Or a promise. She knelt beside it, her breath catching in her throat. The rabbit's fur was damp from morning dew, its body still warm. Not a wild kill. Not a stray coyote offering. This was Ash's doing. Had to be. Her eyes scanned the trees. No movement. No sound. Just the hush of leaves rustling in the breeze. Then, from the corner of her eye, movement. Slow. Cautious. From behind a patch of ferns near the edge of the woods, a shadow emerged. Lithe, low to the ground. A body, lean and sharp with muscle. Ears perked. Eyes familiar. Ash. He didn't run to her. He didn't cry or purr or collapse in exhaustion. He simply stood there, watching. Like he was saying, I made it. And he had. His coat was dusty, bits of burr clinging to his legs. A shallow scratch marred one cheek. But he was whole. More than that, he was proud. Different. Older. Wiser. Wild. Grace didn't move. Didn't speak. She just sat on the steps, her eyes filling before she could stop them. Ash took one step closer. Then another. Then paused. They were no longer woman and kitten, rescuer and rescued. They were something else now. Something looser. More sacred. Grace gave a soft smile. You don't have to stay, she whispered. Ash blinked slowly. Then, without a sound, he turned and disappeared into the trees. But not before his tail gave the faintest flick. Like a wave. A goodbye. Or maybe, just maybe, a see you. Roots in the silence. Healing doesn't always roar, it often walks beside you on quiet feet and leaves before you realize it's gone. The forest didn't give her a sign the next day. Or the one after that. The porch stayed empty. No rabbit. No paw prints. No sign of Ash. The pen sat untouched beneath a carpet of pine needles, its door still half-hinged from the night of the storm. Grace stood by it sometimes, not looking for him exactly, but remembering him. How small he had once been. How big he had become. How, somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing him as something fragile and started seeing him as something free. But freedom meant goodbye. And goodbye, she was learning, wasn't the same as loss. She resumed her quiet routines. Each morning she brewed 2 cups of tea out of habit. She drank one slowly. The second, she poured into the soil beneath the porch's edge, right where she had found the rabbit days ago. The steam curled up like smoke from a forgotten prayer. Her grief was no longer a scream, or even a whisper. It had become something like breath, something she carried without trying, without fighting. She began to walk the forest again. Not with desperation, but with curiosity. She found herself pausing at tracks she once would have missed, tiny cloven hooves, raccoon prints, coyote scat turned white from sun and time. Signs of life. Of wildness. Of survival. She had joined a new rhythm now. And it didn't need her permission. One afternoon in late May, she found a trail. Not Ash's. Too small. Too light. They wandered from the creek up the ridge, looped near her porch, and disappeared into the underbrush behind the greenhouse. Young Bobcat, she guessed. Maybe even Ash's sibling, if the timing was right. Or maybe Ash had passed through again, silently, on light feet, unseen but not unfelt. That night, she stepped out onto the porch, leaned against the railing, and looked out into the trees. The moon hung low, golden and swollen. Owls called in the distance. She didn't expect him to appear. But still, she whispered, "Good night, Ash," and let her words vanish into the branches. Then she went back inside. She reopened her emails from the Wildlife Center and offered to foster again. First a juvenile raccoon, still limping from a trap wound. Then a litter of red fox kits orphaned in a brush fire. One by one, the cabin filled with quiet paws, cautious eyes, and trembling trust. She welcomed it all. The noise. The mess. The risk. She had learned from Ash that loving something wild meant never asking it to stay. It meant building a space soft enough for it to land, if only for a while. And that was enough. One evening, she pulled her leather notebook from the shelf and flipped to the final page. Ash's page. The edges were worn now, the ink faded in spots where her thumbs had lingered too long. She added one final line beneath her last entry. I didn't rescue him. I remembered how to live because he let me love him. She placed the notebook next to the photograph. The one she no longer turned face down. And as she sat in her armchair, a fox kit asleep at her feet, the wood stove humming softly beside her, she realized something. She hadn't returned to the world. The world had returned to her. In the eyes of the broken. In the small, wild things who found her when they needed warmth. And in the silent space where one young bobcat had once laid his head, looked at her like she was more than just a stranger, and reminded her what it meant to be alive. In a world where everything moves fast and healing often feels out of reach, Ash's story reminds us of a quiet truth: sometimes, healing doesn't come through answers, it comes through connection. Not every bond is meant to last forever, but even the briefest touch of trust between two lost souls can change everything. Grace didn't set out to save a wild animal. And Ash didn't come looking for love. Yet, together, they found a path forward, proof that even broken things can become whole in the presence of patience, care, and silent understanding. And maybe that's the lesson for us. What if the wild thing you're meant to heal isn't a bobcat or a bird, but a part of yourself? Here at Paw Prints and Stories, we tell the tales that walk on four legs, but echo in every human heart. So here's your challenge: this week, show kindness to something that doesn't ask for it. A stray. A silence. A scar. See what answers it gives you back. And if stories like this speak to you, don't just listen. Stay with us. Because out here, in the space between wild and wonder, that's where the real stories begin.